Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today we're going to be talking about face down spells and permanents. It may surprise you to know that this is something that's existed since the very beginning of Magic, with Illusionary Mask in Alpha. It graduated from one of gimmick to fully fledged mechanic when Morph debuted in Onslaught. Then it was revisited in Time Spiral Block, and from there it went on to have a number of reskins and variants in future sets, including Manifest and Megamorph in Tarkir, Yedora in Commander 2021, Cybermen in the Doctor Who set, and of course, most recently, Cloak and Disguise in Karlov Manor. Along the way, various complications, interesting interactions were discovered, and of course, there have also been evolving into ever more complex variations, just like the Morph mechanic itself. So let's strap in and explore exactly how face down spells and permanents work in Magic. First off, how do face down spells work? If you have a card with some ability that lets you cast it face down, you can move it face down onto the stack and cast it according to the rules of that ability. In particular, if you want to cast a Disguise card face down, you have to say that you're using the Disguise ability. That's how the game knows that it will have Ward once it's in play. Casting a face down spell follows the rules for casting spells generally. The rule or effect that's letting you play the spell face down will describe the characteristics of that spell. Or, in the absence of such a description, the spell will be a 2/2 creature spell with no creature types, no name, no abilities, and no mana cost. The characteristics of the face down spell are the ones that will be evaluated to see if there are any restrictions or additional costs imposed on the casting of spells. For example, Ugin the Ineffable will give all of your Morph spells a discount when you play them face down, even if the front face of the spell is not colorless. Or you wouldn't be able to cast anything face down with Morph if you control a Steel Golem, even the ones that aren't creatures. Cornered Market is a little bit more interesting. See, to count as having the same name, two objects must have at least one name in common. It's not possible for a spell that doesn't have a name to have the same name as anything, therefore Cornered Market cannot stop you from casting a face down spell. Permissions to cast spells can be stacked, so if you had a Vidalcan Orrery, then that means that you could play a Morph creature face down at instant speed. Or if you exile a Morph creature with Ragavan, you could cast it face down, in any way that you would normally legally be able to cast it. But there's one trick that you need to be aware of. Morph is an alternative cost, and you can only apply one alternative cost to any given spell. So for instance, you could not use Dauthi Voidwalker to cast a Morph creature face down, because if you're casting something via Dauthi Voidwalker, then you have to cast it without paying its mana cost, which counts as an alternative cost. Therefore, you also would not be able to apply a Morph cost to such a spell, since it would be a different alternative cost. Here are some challenge questions on this theme to test your understanding. First, let's say that you control a Goblin Warchief. How much would it cost to play a Skirk Commando face down? The answer is you would still have to pay 3. Remember, you're casting the spell face down. It doesn't have any creature types, so the game doesn't know that you're casting a Goblin spell. In the same way, before it's turned up, the Skirk Commando is not a Goblin, so it would not have haste. How about this one? Amy plays a Grizzly Bears while she controls Aethersworn Canonist. Can she then cast a face down Morph? And here the answer is no. Morphs are creature spells only. They do not count as artifacts, even though they are colorless. Next up, can you cast a Towering Baloth face down into a Void Winnower? And this one is a little bit tricky. Recall that only the characteristics of the face down spell are evaluated to determine whether the spell can be cast. So the mana value of Towering Baloth being 8 is not relevant at all here. The fact that we're paying 3 mana to cast the spell is also not relevant. The game looks at the mana value, not how much mana we're actually spending. The face down Morph spell has no mana cost, which means that the CR defines its mana value to be 0. As Void Winnower helpfully reminds us, 0 is even, meaning that we could not cast Towering Baloth, or any other creature with Morph, face down this way. How about with Allurin? Could we use that to play a face down Morph creature at instant speed? And the answer is unfortunately no. This would work except for one detail. Have you spotted it? To use Allurin's permission, you would need to cast the spell without paying its mana cost. This is not going to be possible if you're casting the spell with Morph, which is another alternative cost. Now that we've covered face down spells, let's consider face down permanents. On the battlefield, a face down permanent will have characteristics matching the spell that it was cast as, or else specified by the effect that turned it face down. Those characteristics are its copyable values, and we'll talk a lot more about the ramifications of that in a bit. But for now, let's consider that some of the practical applications of having cards face down on the battlefield. The obvious purpose is that your opponent doesn't know what they are. But they do know one thing. They know the order that they entered the battlefield. So let's say that your opponent has Morph in play, and you peek at their hand, and you see that they have a different Morph creature. If they play a Morph creature next turn, they cannot mix the cards up so that you wouldn't be able to tell which is which. Another thing to note is that Morph card's controller can look at them at any time. This means that if you threaten your opponent's Morph creature, you could see what it is. There's other things that the game, and therefore the players in it, also know about all cards that might give a Morph away. This would include a card's owner and whether it's a commander. These are not characteristics, they're just properties of a card that the game always has access to. You might have noticed a specific practical problem with abilities that let you cast a card face down. If your opponent cannot see it, how can they know that the player didn't just say the card that they played had Morph and just put any random worthless card down as a 2/2 for 3? Anytime a face-down spell or permanent changes zones, other than the obvious case of a face-down spell resolving, the owner needs to reveal to all players what that card is before that happens. And the same is true if that player leaves the game. Whether that player won or lost, the player needs to reveal any face-down spells, permanents, and cards in exile put there via the foretell mechanic to confirm that the cards legitimately have the appropriate abilities. That still leaves the question of what would happen if a player played a face-down card and it didn't have one of those mechanics. Obviously, the first thing to know is that if the judge believes the player intentionally made that play because a 3-mana 2/2 was better than whatever that card actually was, the penalty would be a disqualification for cheating, regardless of what type of tournament it is. The same goes for if a judge believes the player intentionally didn't reveal a card that they needed to in order to cover up the fact that they illegally played it face down, even if the initial illegal act was an honest mistake. Remember, honesty is the best policy. If you notice a mistake in your game, call for a judge. Don't try to get away with it. On the other hand, it is definitely possible that a player could make that mistake honestly. Like maybe the artwork is similar, or the player is borrowing a deck with a bunch of foreign cards and was wrong about what one of them did, or maybe they were just playing too fast and they grabbed the wrong one. If this happened at a regular rel event, like an FNM, then I would probably just reveal what the card was supposed to be as appropriate and remind the player to be more careful. At a more serious competitive rel event, the appropriate infraction, penalty, and fix for failing to reveal a face-down card is a warning for a hidden card error, and the card is revealed if possible. This is actually a change that was made around the Tarkir block, and there was a time in Magic's history when the penalty was a lot stiffer, but what I just said is the correct ruling now. The penalty if a player is found to have played a card face down when that card does not have any such mechanic, letting the player do so, that would be a game loss. And again, for hidden card error. It is possible to downgrade this if the player has a legitimate morph or disguise card in their hand and catches the mistake before adding any new cards to their hand. Some players might wonder why the penalty for failing to reveal a morph would be a warning, but the penalty for catching it during a game is a game loss. And the basic reasoning behind this is that, well, the amount of times where promoting a worthless card in your hand to a Grey Ogre, or even a Grey Ogre with Ward 2, is pretty low. Getting game loss for failure to reveal, something that was almost always an honest mistake, was seen as being a little bit too harsh. I'll link the article in the description that goes into a lot more detail about this if you're interested in a fuller explanation, but for now, let's just talk about the way that face-down cards get turned face-up, by unmorphing them. So, okay, I have a confession to make for all of the non-native English speakers in the audience. Unmorph is not actually a real word. It's just something I and a lot of other Magic players use to refer to the process of turning a card with morph face up via its morph ability. Manifested cards have their own slightly different process to turn them face up, which is colloquially referred to as unmanifesting. It remains to be seen whether undisguising and uncloaking will settle in as new Magic vocabulary in their own right, but it certainly seems likely. In any case, whichever of these you're using to turn a permanent face up, basically everything is exactly the same except that manifested and cloaked permanents are turned face up by paying their mana costs, and you can only do that if the front face of the card is a creature. Morph and Disguise have costs that you pay the associated cost with the ability, and you can do that no matter what card type they are. You can also choose how to turn a permanent face up if there are multiple ways that are applicable. So, for example, if you manifest a creature that has morph normally, you could choose to either unmorph it or unmanifest it. When you turn a face-down permanent face up, its characteristics given to it by the effect that made it be face down end. This means that turning a disguised permanent face up will cause it to lose ward. In the same way, the permanent will stop being colorless and regain its normal name, abilities, creature types, and so on. You can turn a permanent face up anytime you have priority, and that does not count as casting a spell or activating an ability. So you can do this even in the face of effects that prevent you from doing that or make them cost more. The official term that the game rules uses for turning something face up is a special action. One well-known consequence of this is that you could unmorph a willbender to change the target of a sudden death. Split Second says players cannot cast spells or activate abilities, but unmorphing is neither of those. Triggered abilities also work as normal in the face of Split Second. It's just that it's kind of difficult to make an ability trigger in that case, so it doesn't come up very often. One other consequence of being a special action is that special actions do not use the stack. There's no point in between where you say that you're unmorphing, unmanifesting, uncloaking, or undisguising a creature, and the point where you pay the mana, and the point where you physically turn it face up for an opponent to respond. You just flash the front face of the card to show what the appropriate cost is, pay it, and then turn the card face up. All of that happens with no chance for the opponent to play any spells or activate any abilities. This is great news from a practical perspective, since that means that you don't have to wait in between that process where you pay the mana and where you turn it face up. There's no way for them to respond. Now, getting a bit technical, the process for unmorphing and undisguising involves showing that the front face has the appropriate ability, meaning that if some continuous effect is acting on that creature and it takes the ability away, something like maybe a turn to frog, you cannot turn it face up this way. Cloak and Manifest do not have this problem because they just require that you show the permanent's mana cost. I made a whole video about this specific interaction, so I recommend that you check that out if you'd like a little bit more info. If you're wondering why turning permanents face up has this special handling where it isn't a spell or an ability, I really don't know. I have no idea why it couldn't have just been an activated ability. I'm guessing it's because they didn't want you to be able to stifle it, since paying the morph cost kind of gives away what the creature is. Or else maybe there's some kind of a technical reason related to the process for activating an ability that existed at that time. If anyone has any hard data on this, I would love to see it in the comments. Here's a couple of challenge questions to test your understanding. First, let's say you flicker a face-down creature. What happens? Okay, so this isn't something that I've talked about yet this episode, but if you've been a fan of the channel for a while, maybe you know that anytime something gets exiled, the default is for it to get exiled face up, unless the effect says otherwise. Flicker doesn't, so the morph will be exiled face up. Likewise, the default is to put something on the battlefield face up, and since Flicker says nothing to the contrary, that's what will happen too. Depending on the morph cost of your creatures, this could be a very cost-effective way of getting a big one onto the field. Next, Amy manifests a Dryad Arbor. Can she turn it face up? And the answer is no. To unmanifest a card, Amy would need to reveal the front face and show what its mana cost is, then pay that cost. Because Dryad Arbor does not have a mana cost, this isn't possible. Well, what about this? Amy manifests a Soul Ring, and then she plays a March of the Machines. Can she use that to turn the Soul Ring face up? And again, the answer is no. To unmanifest a permanent, you have to specifically show that the permanent is represented by a creature card. Soul Ring may be a creature right now, but that piece of cardboard doesn't say creature anywhere on it. Finally, let's say that Amy manifests a Flaxen Intruder. Can she turn it face up? And this time the answer is yes. Amy reveals it and pays green, and Flaxen Intruder is a creature card, which means that that's its mana cost, so we're good to go. I guess I should also mention that even a manifested permanent that's not a creature can still be turned face up in other ways, like a Break Open. And for that matter, there's other things that can turn a permanent face down, like an Ixidron. Although it's not possible for Ixidron to turn everything face down, though. Double face cards, tokens, and cards that are already face down will stay as they are, since it isn't possible to turn any of those face down. In case you're curious, you still can manifest a double face card. That works just fine. You can even unmanifest it in the normal way if the front face is a creature. What will not work is trying to turn a face down instant or sorcery face up. If one of these is manifested, even a Break Open or similar cannot turn them face down. Instants and sorceries cannot exist on the battlefield, and if you try to turn one face up, the controller just reveals that it's an instant or sorcery and puts it back face down. Alright, now I promised I would talk about how copy effects interact with face down permanents, and strap in because this is a little bit crazy. Remember how I said the game sets the characteristics of face down permanents according to the effect that put them face down? Well, that's acting on their copyable values. So if you were to clone a face-down Morph, then that clone becomes a colorless 2/2 with no name, no mana cost, no abilities. If you clone a disguise, the clone will have those same characteristics, except it will also have Ward 2, because that is something the disguise ability builds into the copyable values. If the creature that you cloned later turns face up and has new, better characteristics, well, that's too bad. The copyable information gets locked in at the time that clone becomes a copy, and it does not get updated later. Also, the clone cannot be turned face up even if you're copying a creature with Morph, because being face down or face up is part of a permanent's status, not its copyable characteristics. It's the same as how if you were to clone a tapped creature, the clone still enters the battlefield untapped. If you clone a face down creature, the clone will still enter the battlefield face up. So you would not be able to use some other ability to turn it face up. For my money, the reverse situation is even more interesting. Let's say that we had a face down Towering Baloth and we used a Cyto shape to make it into a copy of Grizzly Bears. What would Towering Baloth's characteristics be? Could we turn it face up? So copy effects actually have their own sublayers in layer 1. In order to sort this out, let's observe that copy effects apply before any changes from characteristics resulting from a permanent's status. Accordingly, the final values of Towering Baloth's characteristics do not change at all after the Cyto shape makes it a copy of Grizzly Bears, since the morph information overwrites the copy effect. Towering Baloth is still a colorless 2/2 with no name, although there is one important difference. Because Towering Baloth is now a copy of Grizzly Bears, which does not have morph, it is impossible to unmorph it this turn. You won't be able to show what its front face's morph cost would be because the copy effect overwrites this. In case you're wondering, yes, you could turn a Towering Baloth face up if you Cyto shaped it into a creature that has morph normally, like this Branch Snap Lorien here. If you did that, you could unmorph it for just 1 green mana, and if you did, the Towering Baloth would be a 4/1 Trampler. That was a lot of information. Let's cool down with one final round of challenge questions. The answers here could come from any of the information that we've talked about so far, so they'll be extra challenging. Let's say you Bile Blight a face-down creature. Does that wipe all of the face-down creatures out? And the answer is no. Face-down creatures do not have a name, so that means they cannot have the same name as anything else, even other face-down creatures. In fact, if the blighted creature had a spy kit, other face-down creatures still wouldn't have the same name as it. Next up, Amy returns her Grizzly Bears to the battlefield face down via Yedora. Then she plays a Vesuva as a copy of the face down bear. What are Vesuva's characteristics? The Grizzly Bears will have the characteristics specifically defined by Yedora's ability when it returns to the battlefield, a forest land. Those are Grizzly Bear's copyable values, so that is what Vesuva becomes. Notice that Yedora did not make the returned card into a basic forest, so both the Vesuva and the Grizzly Bears will be vulnerable to a wasteland. Amy plays a Cyber Conversion to turn Nick's Defenestrated Phantasm face down. Can Nick undisguise it? What will be its characteristics if he does? And to answer this, let's recall that, like unmorphing an object, you can undisguise it anytime the affected permanent is face down. It does not have to be face down because you cast it with disguise. So Nick could turn it back face up for its disguise cost. For the new characteristics, this one is also a little bit weird. See, usually if some effect said that target creature was a 2/2 Cyberman artifact creature, that continuous effect would last indefinitely. But this is a special case. Cyber Conversion is listing characteristics that the face-down creature will have, and so, therefore, these characteristics will expire as soon as the permanent is turned face up. Accordingly, the Defenestrated Phantom will have all of its own normal characteristics, i.e. it will not be an artifact, it will be a 4/3, white flyer. Note that it will at no time during this process have Ward 2. It doesn't just get that ability for free for being face down. You need to actually cast it for its disguise cost for that to happen. Finally, one last really fun one to cap it off. Amy threatens Nick's Jeskai Infiltrator and attacks and connects with it. What happens? And the answer is that Amy controls this trigger, so she's the one who performs all the instructions. Amy will manifest Jeskai Infiltrator and the top card of her own library. Although the threatened effect wears off at the end of turn, in changing zones, the Jeskai Infiltrator is no longer considered to be the same permanent, so Amy will retain control of it. However, a card's owner is public knowledge, meaning that all of the players in the game will know which of the 2 cards Amy manifested is hers and which one is Nick's. If they're both using the same kind of sleeves, Amy is responsible for making sure that other players in the game have access to that information. Wow. Give yourself a big pat on the back if you were able to follow all of that straight through to the end. Hopefully with this, you'll have the confidence to make rulings involving any type of face down scenario that you come across. If there's anything you're not sure about, ask in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.